There were lots of townspeople who came to every meeting. All the cameras and reporters covered all these meetings. I had been interviewed before this began, and reporters kept telling me, there's no way this will ever work. Why are you doing this? This is a fool's errand. And so from the very moment I stepped in that room, I faced a really significant challenge.
I'm Julie. Welcome to Uncomfy, a podcast about sticking with moments that challenge us. We share the stories of real people in moments that challenged their perspective. And instead of getting angry or shutting down, they stuck with the discomfort. They stayed curious and open, and they're glad they did. We hope these stories inspire you to stick with it too, because there is so much to gain. New empathy, deeper relationships, more clarity about our own views. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get uncomfy. Here's a story about a community in crisis making a really difficult decision. My guest today is Rich Harwood. He's the president and founder of the Harwood Institute, which is a national nonprofit that helps people and groups to solve pressing problems. Rich, welcome. It's so great to have you today.
Hey, Julie, thanks so much for having me.
Let's dive right into your story. Back in early 2013, you got a call to help the residents of Newtown, Connecticut resolve an agonizing issue. What were they trying to work out?
Well, first, just a number of weeks before that, on December 14th, 2012, a young man walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School and gunned down 20 first graders and 6 adults, the worst massacre that we had known up till that point. And just a number of weeks after that, I got a phone call from the mayor of the city of Newtown and said, would I come to the community and help design and guide the process by which the community would make a decision about what to do with the school building, which at the time was still a crime scene. And Julie, when I got that call, I knew it was coming, but when I got it and I hung up, I sat in my office for, I think, a couple of hours and just thought about, what does this really mean? Am I really up for it? There's no roadmap for helping a community move forward under these conditions. How does one imagine how to lead a process like that? And so initially, what I struggled with was, should I do it? Am I up for dealing with and absorbing the trauma that the community had experienced? Do people even want me there? Is there some way forward out of something so inexplicable and horrific as this? And so I thought long and hard about it. And my initial response was to say no.
Did you wonder if it was even the right time? Why not just kind of let it lie for a while and then circle back to it when some healing had begun?
Look, I think there was a large portion of the community that did want to wait. They didn't see the need to rush. Now, the state legislature had said they wanted to contribute money to help rebuild the school. The legislature was going to go out of session, I believe, in May or June. So there was a potential need to move forward. But many folks in the community said, look, let's wait, let's hold off. And so, those doubts were with me, whether or not I was the right person. And then, honestly, Julie, I began to think, look, I had worked in Flint, Michigan, right after they had lost 30,000 auto jobs, after they had lost tens of thousands of jobs before then. The community had experienced trauma, deep poverty. I had worked in a mental health crisis center and worked with people who were experiencing trauma. So I'm a person of faith. And I recalled the story of Moses standing before the burning bush amid all his doubts and fears as God called him forward. And so I came to believe that when one is called forward, if one is capable of helping, of aiding someone else, you have a responsibility or an obligation to answer the call. And so because of these different experiences, I decided that to the best of my ability, I would step forward.
What was that first meeting like? Who was in the room? And sort of, how did that feel for you?
The mayor had set up a task force of 28 elected officials from 4 different governing boards, many of whom on those individual governing boards didn't like each other. And surely there was conflict between and among them across the governing boards. And many have known each other for decades, if not longer. So they had a lot of deep relationships. And look, what I learned very early on was this was not about a building at all, really. This was about whether or not a community could pivot from trauma and despair to healing and hope and take its first public step forward as a community. And so the first meeting, when I walked into the city council chamber room, it was a relatively small room. They were all sitting around a sort of U-shaped table. There were lots of townspeople who came to every meeting. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, CBS News, all the cameras and reporters covered all these meetings. I had been interviewed before this began, and reporters kept telling me, there's no way this will ever work. Why are you doing this? This is a fool's errand. And of the 28 task force members, I had maybe met 3 before that first meeting when we were going public. And as I went around the table to shake hands with the task force members, introduce myself, about half of them really didn't want to shake my hand. They didn't want me there. They didn't believe they needed an outsider to help them. And so from the very moment I stepped in that room, I faced a really significant challenge.
So what did you have to bring to bear? What did you have to muster? What traits, what responses, what skills in that moment in order to stay at the table instead of to just be like, I can tell you guys don't want me here. You know, I don't have a lot to gain here. I'm out. Right?
Well, I think the first thing that you have to do is understand that this is not about you, that this is about folks in a community who are struggling to talk to one another. They're struggling to process what's happened to them. They're grieving. Maybe some haven't even begun the process of grieving yet. And so the first thing one has to know if they accept a role like this is it's not about you. The second thing one has to know is that your job is to create a sense of security for people, a sense of safety, that someone in the room knows what they're doing, which means that you have to be incredibly present, incredibly calm, incredibly focused, and to see your role as helping to guide people firmly, but gently. Or the phrase I use is firm with grace. And so part of my job was to create a sense that there were a series of steps that we were going to take together so they knew exactly where we were going, and to help them realize that there was no perfect answer to something as horrific and inexplicable as what happened. And really what they had to decide was, do we want to tear this down and start again? Do we want to go to a different site? So there was a series of underlying fundamental choices that needed to be made, or, which I kept saying to them, we can stop the process now. You don't have to move forward. We always can sort of just say, okay, we gave it a try. Let's come back to it a year from now. So I think there were moments like that. There were moments where the mayor and I had to decide, were we going to trust each other to go the next step? And we had to work that out. Look, she was the leader of this community. I wasn't. I didn't live there. And I had to be deeply respectful of her position. At the same time, I had to say to her, you have to give me the room to do this. We have to have the room to do this. It's not a linear process. In any process, but particularly something like this, people are going to say something, they're going to want to circle back and circle back again and circle back again and circle back again. There's going to be all sorts of emotions flowing through each of these discussions that people are going to have to work through. So there's nothing linear about this. And yet we have to keep it moving forward.
So you had a lot of doubts going in. The members of the group had a lot of doubts going in. There was sort of this external pressure from the state legislature that was like to give you some money, but we need you to make a decision here before we can allocate this money. So it was like not a perfect environment. And you had all of these external expectations as well. So while you're kind of preaching this message of patience and care and let's do this in the time that it requires, there was a moment, there was a meeting, a lot of these meetings were happening publicly. And there was one that was a couple months in where I think everybody was there, like all the cameras. And for some reason it had kind of been telegraphed that a decision might be made at this meeting. And it didn't work out. Tell us about that moment and what was going through your mind.
Well, I was sitting at breakfast in my house outside Washington, getting ready to fly up to Hartford and then to drive to Newtown. I got a call from the mayor's office saying, pick up the Wall Street Journal. There's a lead article in it. And the article was that 30 teachers from Sandy Hook Elementary School had got together and written a letter and released it publicly saying, under no conditions will we go back to that school. And this was where we had said publicly, we think we're ready to make a decision. So I flew up that afternoon. I got there. I walked into the city council chamber. There were hundreds of people there. There were all the cameras. Everyone was ready for a decision. And the mayor and I huddled privately, and we decided that the one time we would have a private meeting would be tonight. And so I walked back into the room to the center where I always stood to lead these meetings. I was the only one standing amid these hundreds of people and all these television cameras. And I said, everyone but the task force is going to have to clear the room. So everyone cleared out, and in came the 30 teachers. This was really a horrific experience, to be honest. So they came in, and there was these 30 teachers or so. They were the task force members. There was one or two mental health workers and myself. And the teachers all gathered in front of the task force members around a table, and they huddled up together almost as if they were building a human fortress to protect themselves. And over the next couple of hours, they began to tell us one story after another about hearing the gunshots ring through the hallway, about barricading their doors with anything they could find so the gunmen couldn't come into their classroom, hearing their colleagues get gunned down in the hallways. One story after another after another. They talked about how now they had returned to a school that had been loaned to Newtown, where these kids could attend. And these teachers talked about, even though they now had teacher assistants in their room, that they couldn't bring themselves to teach many times, many days. They had such a difficult time getting to school. Their kids couldn't learn. The siblings of kids were affected. Everyone in the town was affected. And so for those 2, maybe 3 hours, we sat there and listened to these stories. And we didn't want to rush them. We didn't want to tell them we had to go back and let everyone back into the room. We just let it go for as long as they wanted to speak. And then finally sort of came to a close, and the teachers left, and the hundreds of townsfolk came back into the room. The television cameras and reporters came back into the room, and I stood in the middle of the room again and said, after our last meeting, tonight's not the night for a decision. We're going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to allow the task force to process a little bit more. I'm going to leave them with a couple of questions to think about between now and the next meeting. And then I said, we're going to reconvene in 2 weeks. Well, in 2 weeks, we came back and we met. It was midnight, and we still hadn't made a decision. And the task force was still somewhat divided about what to do. And finally, one of the task force members raised his hands and said, I'm willing to come a little way to see if we can make a decision. And that sort of opened the ability to figure out a path forward. And then other people started to step forward. So the decision wasn't 51-49. It wasn't 75-25. It was unanimous. And what I took from that experience, because again, there's no sure bet even that night, it looked as though it was going to fall apart. And I can't tell you the number of interviews I did the morning of that meeting where reporters, national reporters, said to me, again, we told you this would not work. And I kept saying to them, it is always the moment before the decision when things look like they're going to fall apart the most. That's true in life. It's true in organizations. It's true in a situation like this. But here's the thing. When those task force members came together, it was a sign of people saying, we can be for something. It was a time of people saying, I'm going to reach out to others who may hold a different point of view, and we're going to try to find a way forward. It was a time when people said, we can't have everything that we want. We're going to have to compromise. There are a lot of lessons embedded in what happened in Newtown, not just for Newtown, but I think for our country today, moving forward.
What was the decision ultimately that they made?
Tear down the building and rebuild on the same spot, though the building would have a different orientation. So it would not feel or even be a replica of the old building. It would not appear to be on the same footprint in a sense. It would be a new building on the old site. And that helped people in the community work through the trauma, because one of the things we kept hearing from people is we have our own memories of going to that school. We have siblings who are going to that school who want to go back. And so we don't want to go back to the same place, but we also don't want to abandon it. And so that's where they ended up landing.
How has that experience shaped the work that you have done in the intervening 10 years?
I think it's made me even more aware because of the communities that we work with across the country. And given the conditions of our country today, the experience in Newtown has made me even more acutely aware of the trauma and the despair that so many people are facing in their personal lives and that we're facing collectively in our shared lives. And that how we work through that is as important as where we end up. You know, everyone wants to get to the final answer. And when you've experienced trauma, there is no final answer. It's something you just keep working through. But the other thing is that how you work through it, how you work through any difficult thing, any kind of despair, any kind of fear, is really critical, because we each come to those things on a different timeline, at a different pace, with a different readiness, with different capabilities. We can help, like I had to do in Newtown or in Flint or in other places, but we need to be sensitive and aware to where they're starting. We need to be sensitive and aware to how fast they can go. We need to be sensitive and aware to how much trust exists. We have to be aware and sensitive to what enables people to have a sense of voice in their lives, to feel visible, to feel that they can exercise some semblance of control. And I think that's critically important, and even more important today than when I started doing this work 35, 40 years ago.
And you actually have a civic campaign underway right now tied to
Yeah.
the 2024 presidential election. Describe what that is. What are you hoping to accomplish?
I think that so many people have retreated from public life. They're afraid, they're fearful, they're lonely, they're anxious. We're separating and segregating from one another. Our news media and politicians manufacture and stoke division for their own gain. And I happen to believe that the way forward in our country is not to amp up more divisive politics. It's to find a new civic path forward. And I think that civic path begins in our local communities. People coming together and figuring out what we can agree on amid our real differences, how we can build together, how we can restore a sense of belief and faith in one another. So it's going to have to start in local communities. That's where all change in America, sustainable, big change, has begun. But here's the thing, Julie, it's always started small. It's always started small. So we have 4 quick mantras that we use in our work. Turn outward toward one another. Get in motion, because good things only happen when we're in motion, not when we're planning and sitting still. Start small to go big, and create a new trajectory of hope. And everyone told us we were crazy to do this during the presidential race, that we'd be drowned out, that we wouldn't make any progress. Here's the reality of what's happened. Most political candidates, most campaigns only go to where their voter strongholds are. We're the only national campaign that I know of that's been invited to communities all across the political spectrum. It's not because they like me or this campaign. It's because people are hungry for a new path forward, and they realize that it's going to start in their local communities. And that's why I think the campaign's working.
The campaign is called Enough, Time to Build 2024, right?
Correct.
Rich Harwood is the president and founder of the Harwood Institute, which you can find online at theharwoodinstitute.org. Rich, thanks so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks for getting uncomfy with us today. I would love to hear about a stick with it moment you've had recently. What was the perspective or the situation that challenged you? Why did you decide to stay uncomfortable, to stick with it rather than bail out or get defensive? Drop a line to uncomfy@byu.edu, and maybe we'll even include you on the show. And be sure to check out my other podcast, Top of Mind, where we explore tough topics in a way that can help us practice staying open and curious when facing challenging perspectives. You can find Top of Mind on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. Uncomfy is a BYU radio podcast. Samuel Benson produces it, and the team includes Enrique Prado, James Hoops, Sam Payne, and Brandon Lewis. Our theme music was composed by Kelsey Ney. I'm Julie Rose. A little hoarse this week, but on the mend. Can't wait to get uncomfy with you again next week. Hey friends, if you are on the lookout for another awesome podcast, check out Constant Wonder. It's also from the BYU Radio Network. It's hosted by my friend Marcus Smith, and it is like embarking on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories about our magnificent natural world. As you listen, you'll gain profound insights into different facets of our planet. You'll discover more about nature. I've learned about whales and bees and nematodes from listening to Constant Wonder. And you might even find yourself pondering your own connection to the wonders of this earth. So, wherever you usually get your podcasts, do yourself a favor and go check out Constant Wonder from BYU Radio.